Hello, podcast listeners. We know podcasts are a great way to catch up on a program that you may have missed on KSJE, and it's provided as a free service of this radio station. But you know, KSJE is now listener-supported, and so while you enjoy this podcast, we hope that you'll also take some time to join KSJE. Become a member today. It's quite easy to do. Just go to our website at ksje.com/support and pick the level of support that best matches your budget. Thanks again for listening. Here's your podcast. Ten minutes past 8 o'clock. It is Thursday morning, the 7th day of May, 2026. Good morning, everyone. I'm Scott Michlin. Happy Friday to you. Thanks for joining me this morning here on KSJE. 90.9 FM over the air right here in San Juan County, New Mexico. In Durango, Colorado, we broadcast at 103.3 FM. And if you're hearing my voice anywhere else on the planet, you've gone to our website to tune in, streaming all the time right there from ksje.com. Maybe you're listening through the KSJE radio app, or maybe you've got your smart speaker playing KSJE because it's just that smart. Anyway, it's great to have you all with us this morning. Also, welcome to the viewers who are watching me right now. Video of this program is streaming out live to the KSJE Facebook page and also to our YouTube channel. Something for everyone this morning. And so glad that you're all with us on all of our platforms, because we're going to be talking with one of my favorite guests this morning, Paul Reed from Archaeology Southwest. Paul will be joining us in just a few more moments to talk about the current situation at Chaco Canyon and what's been going on. We'll bring you an update on some of that coming up in the next few moments right here on KSJE. Then, of course, next hour, Mick Hess is going to take us roving with the arts. That is our long-running weekday classical music program starting up after the news at 9:06. Don't forget, you can also connect with us on other forms of social media. If that's your thing, you'll find us on Instagram, on Blue Sky and X, in addition to Facebook and YouTube. And if you're a podcast listener, and who isn't these days, you'll find KSJE podcasts available wherever you listen to podcasts. So check it out, subscribe, and discover some new local programs that you may have missed. Or better yet, just download the KSJE radio app, and you'll have our podcast, our live stream, and much, much more right there with you wherever you go. You'll find it on the App Store and on Google Play. It's the KSJE radio app. Outside our studios at San Juan College this morning, there was a freeze warning overnight, and you can tell because it's 33 degrees this morning in Farmington under mostly sunny skies. We're expecting a sunny and eventually warmer day today with a high of 67 in Farmington. Clear skies tonight, not as cold, 47 for a low tonight. It'll be warmer tomorrow with a high of 75 on Friday, sunshine 78 by Saturday, 79 by Sunday, and take a look at Monday, 87 degrees with lots of sunshine Monday and Tuesday of next week, and overnight lows in the mid to lower 50s. Back with my guest, Paul Reed from Archaeology Southwest, right after this on KSJE. KSJE is supported by San Juan Regional Medical Center, your community hospital serving the Four Corners. With a 115-year history of improving the quality of life, health, and care of individuals and families throughout our region. When life happens, San Juan Regional Medical Center is here to serve everybody. Find out more at sanjuanregional.com. KSJE is supported by Riverfest New Mexico, flowing through time, May 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. 2026 is the 40th anniversary of the River Reach Foundation, Farmington's 125th anniversary, and the 250th birthday of the USA. Riverfest New Mexico, flowing through time, May 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, along the Animas River in Farmington. Find out more online at riverfestnewmexico.com.
Now back to Studio A and the award-winning Scott Michlin morning program on KSJE.
And back in the studio with my guest, as I mentioned, from Archaeology Southwest, Paul Reed is joining us this morning from his home remotely. Paul, it's good to see you. There he is. Thanks for being with us, of course.
Hey, Scott. Good morning. So glad to be back on.
I imagine it's probably colder where you are this morning than it is here in Farmington.
Yeah, I was up pretty early yesterday and just a wee skiff of snow.
Aha.
So, yeah,
Okay.
finally getting a little moisture here in our very wacky weather year.
No kidding. Well, like we say, better late than never, right? We'll take it anytime. So that's important. I know the mountains up here got a little bit too, which is great. So good to see it. But it's good to see you and to give us an update. Last time we chatted, it was kind of on an emergency last minute kind of situation because of what was going on at Chaco Canyon with Chaco Canyon. The government, the federal government had put out a proposal to decrease the buffer around Chaco Canyon, as I recall, and they only gave the public about 7 days to comment on it, and at least that's how I remember it. Please correct me if I'm wrong and give us an update on that situation.
Yeah, sure, Scott. Right. So they've started, a National Environmental Policy or NEPA process, in the language of the environmental nerds,
Right.
to consider revoking the protection zone that so many of us are, our Indigenous and Pueblo partners, so many nonprofits worked on over the last dozen years. And basically the way they've set up the proposal, they have three options. They would revoke all the protection in the 10-mile zone and allow oil and gas and other development, or they would reduce it to 5 miles and then allow work outside that 5-mile zone, or they would just do nothing at all. So the last one is sort of the classic no action alternative, which with the evolution of government processes and the like is in every proposal, but that's never the one they choose, basically.
Got it.
We're thinking with the pro energy, oil and gas bent of this administration that, they're likely to just revoke all the protection.
And so, again, the 7-day comment period was out there. Do we know how many people made comments? I imagine it was quite a few.
Well, right. And we were, really impressed with the response from, our little neck of the world and the world as overall. Our groups logged over 110,000 comments that went in. Now, BLM has put out some information that suggested there were less than 100,000, so this is some sort of counting issue, I suppose. But the point really is that the public does not want this to happen. Overwhelmingly, as we did an initial assessment of what came in, we were over 90%, 95% telling the Department of Interior and this administration, just leave Chaco alone. So, we're pretty impressed with the way folks turned out and made their opinions known.
Sure. And I know, of course, your organization, Archaeology Southwest, you've got a website that's got your position on this, which is no surprise, against any changes to protections around Chaco Canyon. In fact, I think you've gone on record saying you'd like more protections around Chaco Canyon. And then to be clear, we should again remind the audiences this morning that the park itself is not under threat. This is the area kind of around the park, and that's what we're talking about, yes?
Exactly.
Yeah.
All of our national parks, there's 63, I believe, if the count's right. Those are protected spaces. There's no development of any kind. They are simply set aside to protect natural, cultural, or both resources. But right outside Chaco, we've had different proposals over the last 15 or 20 years to do some drilling. And, one of the points that I really want to make here is that this area is not prime for oil and gas development. If it was, given, the past situations and the way some of our views have evolved through time, wherein we're protecting lands, I think, more carefully now in the 2020s than we were, say, 50, 60 years ago. We don't have extensive oil and gas development around Chaco, and that's because oil and gas resources are marginal. And there's really a few companies in the industry who are saying, hey, we want to go drill right on Chaco's doorstep. So in some ways, opening up this protection zone is kind of just poking people in the eye, and certainly my personal opinion. Others don't have to take that as any kind of truth, but, there are so much more productive areas in our own state where oil and gas is going great guns, right? All we have to do is talk about the Permian and the area around Carlsbad and Roswell. We get some huge percentage. I'm trying to remember the last thing I saw in the news, 30 or 35% of the nation's oil and gas comes out of this one zone in New Mexico. We don't need to drill around Chaco. That is sort of my overwhelming position, and it seems like the public really supports that.
Sure, right. And so I guess with that being said, Paul Reed, is there an opinion of some other folks out there that say, well, so what's the what's the big problem if this were to get changed and this buffer zone were to be made smaller or eliminated altogether? If it's not that great for development, is there any, what's the big concern about just getting rid of this zone, I guess, if it's not that good for oil and gas?
Right. And that's a good point, one that I really want to address head on. It's the idea essentially that we should be able to, we as a greater nation and in our industrial sector, be able to put, massive industrial developments anywhere we want to put them. So that flies in the face of the nation's long history of conservation and preservation of, again, beautiful natural and cultural spaces across the country. I think the first one set aside was Yellowstone in 1872. Our former president from the last century, Teddy Roosevelt, did amazing work setting aside huge chunks of land in conservation easements, national forests, and parks. So the idea that industry should be able to tap into every single place on the planet is just not something that most people, most Americans, and really most world citizens, when they poll folks, that's not what most people agree with. So even if there isn't great potential right now to drill next to Chaco, we don't know what the future holds. In 20 years, 30 years, there might be some other resource, there might be some other reason for companies to want to go in and do some kind of exploratory work of mining of some sort right on Chaco's doorstep. So the idea here is let's create some lasting protection and not have this amazing, special, one-of-a-kind, cultural, sacred place for so many of our Indigenous partners and friends, have this place subject to these kinds of developments. We can take Chaco really off the table. That's the bottom line.
Got it. And I guess, again, for folks that think the same as you and want to see this sacred place, this special place protected, there's probably, I think a lot of folks would say, a better way to maybe put this in permanent legislation, right? Take congressional action, maybe expand the borders of the park itself or do something else. And I believe that's been tried, right? I think there's been proposals to do that, just hasn't gotten the support it needs to pass congressional scrutiny.
Right. That's right, Scott. In 2019, our congressional team from New Mexico introduced a bill. It cleared the U.S. House, with some margin. It went into the Senate. We then got into 2020 and sort of the ravages, the terribleness of COVID. That bill got trapped in the Senate and didn't go anywhere. So there is legislation that's been reintroduced in the last year. And, so folks are continuing to pursue the congressional route to get some permanent protection for this amazing place. In the meantime, then Secretary Deb Haaland in 2023 moved to withdraw this acreage. It's about 336,000, not the biggest piece of land anywhere, but to protect this area and have a set aside that would allow Chaco to be, have this greater level of protection. So again, a lot of people feel like this is really a good thing.
Right. Sure. And so then there are efforts underway to protect it permanently, which would avoid this whole thing that we're talking about, this
right.
From the Department of the Interior.
If we can get a bill through a Congress, some Congress, and get a president sign it, then, that's in place until additional congressional action, could possibly overturn it. So one of the things that I think, hits those of us on the conservation side so hard is that the Secretary of Interior and her department went through a very lengthy process that began with her announcement in November of 2021, all the way through 2022 into 2023 with a very robust public process, 120 days for folks to have their opinions known, multiple meetings, Farmington, Albuquerque, went out near Chaco. So this was a very public, open process. What we're seeing to overturn these protections now is just, we're going to slam this through. We passed through last month a 7-day scoping period. What we're waiting on now is some level of assessment, we think, from the Department of Interior, and then an announcement that there will be yet another short period of comment. And this is just part of the way, again, the NEPA Environmental Policy Act works. They're suggesting that it's going to be extremely short again, 14 days to go through an environmental assessment process. And then at the end of that, officials in the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Land Management will announce, we expect sometime in June probably or July, that this protection is removed permanently. So again, the objection is this took a long time to get in place. Many, many voices were heard. And now, we're trying to sweep all that away with a very, very curtailed process.
Right. And I guess, too, my other question for you, Paul Reed, if you know the answer, and is I imagine there'd be some court challenges to this action since the timeline seems to be so condensed. And I would think there are folks that would say, wait a minute, let's get a judge maybe to say, let's take a breath here and look at some of the precedent and see that maybe this usually doesn't happen in such a short timeline. Are there some legal challenges to what the Department of the Interior is trying to do or attempting to do?
Well, I would definitely believe that if this action goes through and becomes, a permanent action and not just a proposal, that there will be groups that'll step up and take legal action. And, this is kind of the last refuge for people who feel and organizations who feel like the process that's very clearly outlined in the NEPA law is not followed. And, for our part, as we've talked over these years, Scott, our organization and many of our partners have chosen to engage with the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Land Management, really all the way back to the first Obama administration, sitting down with officials, meeting with tribes, meeting with other stakeholders, and trying to go through a process that ends up with what is hopefully the most robust and, sort of the most democratically arrived at decision. And we know that you can't make everyone happy in this world, but and that's not a goal that we ever have because it's just not realistic. But the point of having a robust public comment process and having people's voices heard is that you have then gone through that process and all those voices get heard. And there's maybe less of a feeling then that an administration or an agency has really kind of slammed a decision through that doesn't serve public needs.
Sure. And I wanted to pick up on that a little bit from what you mentioned earlier about when Deb Haaland was the Interior Secretary and tried to, change this buffer zone around Chaco Canyon. There's not a total consensus because there are folks that live in that area that were actually quite vocal against that idea. These are folks that have maybe grazing rights or oil and gas leasing rights and were concerned about that taking away some of their abilities to do something with their land. And so that's another part of this very complicated situation, is it not?
Yeah, Scott, and it's a hugely important part of it. And, we've talked about this before on the show, and I want to be real clear that the federal action impacts only the federal surface and subsurface lands that the Bureau of Land Management manages. So any Navajo allotted lands, any Navajo tribal trust, any other private interests are literally unaffected by the change that Deb Haaland put in place. So there has been a lot of talk that this action to revoke the protection zone is somehow correcting some sort of overstep from before, but I really don't think that reflects the reality on the land. I have heard rumors from friends who live out there that this was going to shut down all development and other sort of, in my mind, pie in the sky conspiracy theories. People wouldn't be able to graze. Those things are absolutely untrue, and I'm glad to go on the record to say that. This was targeting specific oil and gas development on federal surface lands. And, but I think that it serves other interests, perhaps those of, folks in the greater industry to say, hey, this is someone taking away your rights. And, that's a real concern for folks. And I get that, but it's important that we step away from some of the rhetoric and some of the loud voices and say, okay, this is actually about protecting specific pieces of land. The other thing is, it's not a universal opinion out there in the chapters of Nageezi and Counselor in those areas directly affected. It's not universal that folks want oil and gas development. Many people have spoken out about it over the years who live out there, and some of those folks are allotment holders too. So I do think what you said about it being complicated is definitely true. That doesn't mean we have to shove it to the side and say, hey, it's too complicated, let's not talk about it. But what I would like to do, and I think what our partners want, is to talk about it and really be transparent about what the issues are and what the actual effects of this might be. I read some, interesting things that were put out in op-eds about how this was reducing income in the area by millions of dollars. Well, that's actually not true because all existing oil and gas rights, anything that's leased, those have all continued, and there's been no change in that. So the law only was targeting new oil and gas development on federal lands. So, this is a slice of what's happening out there, and anything that was ongoing is still ongoing. So again, it's just, important to kind of separate the facts from the rhetoric and, then begin to look at what's actually happening.
Sure. No, that's very true. And I'm sitting here shocked to hear you say, Paul Reed, that things on the internet may not always be true. Shocked, I tell you. But you're absolutely right. And it's important to get the facts out, to talk about this, and to include all sides. I think you're exactly right about that. And for folks who aren't familiar with this unique part of New Mexico and the checkerboard area that we talk about, and we're very familiar with it because we know if you go any direction for a few dozen miles, you could be in a completely different jurisdiction as to whatever land you're standing on, whether it's federal land or Navajo land or state trust land or other subsections of those types of land. And so it's a really unique and makes things more complicated when you try to talk about trying to pass policies or change policies for any big swath of land in this area, because you are dealing with all these different types of jurisdictions. And so that just adds to another layer on this complicated issue. And so it's important that folks understand that. And if you're not familiar with it, it's kind of hard to put your brain around a little bit about just how many different stakeholders there are in the greater Chaco Canyon area. So, and I know you've been living and breathing that for your whole career, so it's not lost on you how complicated it is out there.
That's right. And, one of the things that I think, I feel like it's a shame to some extent, because I don't know how often these different land managers actually get together to talk about the issues. Certainly with the work that's been going on now from, out of the Farmington field office of BLM, they've been talking for a dozen years now about modifying the land management plan. And they recently sort of stepped away from that to rethink it. And I think they're going to launch another process to think about the next 15 or 20 years of management. That's an extremely important process. And, over those years, there have been representatives of Navajo Nation, of course, all the Indigenous Pueblo nations who have deep ancestral roots, other Indigenous groups nearby. The state land office, for their part, has not participated in the federal process, their choice. We've had Park Service folks come to different meetings. So, that process has allowed, I think, some of the discussion and the dialogue that would really benefit this. But we do live in this kind of crazy chopped up world, right? Because we have our houses on lots, or we have pieces of land, and then you go right over here and it's someone else's land, or you might abut a big chunk of federal or state land, and you literally, go through a gate in a fence, and land management policies can change dramatically. And again, this isn't to say that, it's so complicated, let's not talk about it. Let's talk about it. But as you said, let's get into those complexities and appreciate that this isn't just a matter of getting everybody in a room for an hour.
Right.
And going, okay, we have an agreement. It's a long, complicated process. And certainly there are folks who would say that, our federal government, maybe our state governments, make this harder with the layers of bureaucracy and things. But I feel myself, having gone through different aspects of this over a few decades, that most of what's involved in the process is there to allow the different stakeholders, and even folks who aren't considered stakeholders but are just constituents on a land base or in a state, that they have their opportunity to make their wishes known and have their voices heard, even if ultimately a decision's made that doesn't reflect that great diversity of voices.
Sure. And I wanted to also ask you a bit about just the place of Chaco Canyon. As I said, you've spent a lot of time out there with your work and your career, and you've also brought a lot of folks to the table to talk a little bit about it. I know we've talked on this program a little bit about how important, how sacred it is to lots of Native and Pueblo communities throughout the Southwest. And so I think we're hearing more from them when we talk about the future of Chaco Canyon and the area surrounding Chaco Canyon, because a lot of these other peoples have traced kind of some of their history back to this area and that type of thing. And we're learning more and more, it seems to me, almost every day, right, about how strong those ties and connections are. And so I know those folks are speaking out as well, and your organization, Archaeology Southwest, is giving them a louder voice, it seems, to help amplify some of their either concerns or support about what's been proposed, correct?
Right. I mean, that's something that our organization, I think as we've discussed on the show, Scott, has been going through, a fairly major transformation in the way we do work. We committed a few years ago to really front loading engagement and collaboration with Native and Indigenous groups in all the different areas where we work. And for me on Chaco, I was fortunate to begin doing work about a dozen years ago, and having had the opportunity to begin to meet folks in leadership at different pueblos and with the Navajo Nation, and begin some dialogues that really, for me, have transformed the way I think about, the past, realizing that I'm bringing a very Eurocentric, in many cases, colonial view to the understanding of the past, and that to evolve and better understand that past and to honor Senate communities, I need to step out of that mindset. So that's, I think, had very positive effects for me as well, aside from how I might think about the past in one sense, maybe in a scholarly sense, but also on the public policy side. So something we've also committed to as an organization is taking on projects, working with different partners. I'm working with 5 different parks in northern New Mexico now, doing either cultural resource type projects, landscape projects, outreach projects with the tribes who live in the area. And we're working really hard to bring those voices to the table. And I do want to give a shout out to, different agencies and departments in the federal government. I think we've seen a pretty incredible evolution just in the time I've been doing this over the past few decades, where the federal government would typically undertake action in the past and then announce it to the public and to the affected indigenous tribes and nations. Now they're starting processes early and saying, we want to form, for example, a working group with the 5 or 6 tribes that are closest and others, in sort of concentric circles, if you will, going out, because we want to do a better job managing, say, Bandelier National Monument. In the way that a lot of the folks working in our parks now specifically feel is they can't do that job without having significant, meaningful, and frequent input from the nations that surround these places. So I think that's a huge transition, and really a great one. And I'm thrilled that, I've been able to have some role in this, and that Archaeology Southwest, again, has maybe helped push some of these issues here and there.
Sure. No, I think you should take pride in that, and kudos to you and the others who've worked on that, because we've been talking again on this program for a while now that I think there's been a period of time when Native Americans didn't think their voices were heard by those that were pulling the levers of power in either Santa Fe or Washington. And I think they do have a louder voice today than they ever have, which is an important thing, especially with a site like this and other sites in our region, in our state, that are so sacred to many of these peoples. We're just about out of time, Paul Reed, but I did want to ask you a bit just about, again, if someone is watching us and listening to us and they've not had the pleasure of ever traveling and seeing Chaco Canyon, it certainly is a unique spot. And I guess my point of the question is trying to be about that whole environment around Chaco Canyon, because the sightlines from Chaco extend far beyond the boundaries of the park. And that's another thing, that when you're there, you take in that whole vista of the area, and that's another part of this boundary and part of this protection zone, to be able to protect those sight lines and just the whole experience, so that you don't see just beyond the park boundaries some other kind of development. That's an important part of this conversation too, isn't it?
It definitely is, Scott. If we take the park, it's about 35,000 acres or so. This set aside of protection lands is about 335,000 acres. We keep going out, and one of the things that I've really taken to heart over the years, working with my Pueblo friends and colleagues and other indigenous nations, is that this landscape just keeps going. We have the different land jurisdictions that say, okay, now you're on BLM, now you're on Forest Service, now you're on state lands. But this is a continuous landscape. And, let's go back to, say, 1000 CE, 1,000 years ago or more. This was an amazing integrated large society, with certainly a big hub at Chaco, other places across the landscape, some 35, 40 million acres covering an area the size of the state of Indiana, or one of my favorite analogies, the nation of Ireland, right? This is a huge area that was integrated with folks doing all the things that, complex societies do through time. And now we are here 1,000 years ago trying to go through this process to protect what remains of, this amazing landscape and help and support our Indigenous friends as they continue to protect these places and reconnect. So yeah, it's the boundaries again are things we obviously have to deal with, but I try really hard myself in my own thinking to get beyond those and take on that larger view.
Sure. Well, it's a special place, as you and I both know. And again, I think anyone who's done some traveling have probably been to maybe other historic, sacred sites around the world and can see the encroachment of modern day living as things get closer. And Chaco is one of those places where, thankfully, we don't see that. Maybe an occasional plane flying overhead, but that's really about it. And we're so grateful for that. So, Paul, I'm grateful for you for bringing this to our attention, of course, and continuing to update us on the situation with the protections around Chaco Canyon. And we'll look forward to our next conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. And folks can just stay tuned to archaeologysouthwest.org, and we'll have updates and, let folks know how to comment as we continue to go through the process. So
very good. All right. Paul Reed, thank you so much for joining me. That's Paul Reed from Archaeology Southwest, my guest this morning right here on KSJE. Did you enjoy that podcast? We hope that you did. And if you did, share it with your friends. And if you really want to keep podcasts like this coming, please support KSJE. You can do it easily online at ksje.com.